So I'm starting on page 22, part 1, and I'm going to start here, and if you have already read this section, just skip ahead to the part where you are. The third section was plain and simple and vocabulary building, where I write words and definitions I wanted to learn and use. Words like viscous, impunity, paroxysm, unctuous, nefarious, onanistic, perfidious, and lugubrious. I'll have to look that one up. So these are all his description, again, of the things that he wants to put into his journal and keep track of. The fourth section was devoted to the moments of inspiration when the book ideas came to me in full color flashes, like bits of film remembered or a forgotten conversation suddenly pulsing to life. These were the great notions of sprawling novels that jolted me awake in the middle of the night, or sneaked up on me as I drove my car so that I scrawled them on the white vinyl of the front seat next to my leg. Day and night I wrote down these ideas in my frantic, spastic penmanship. But that is all they ever amounted to, ideas. After recording them in my journal, I'd flip through these pages, reading them to myself, pondering each idea, and rejecting them, all of them. But they weren't all lousy. I just didn't have the confidence and the determination to sit still and nurture them properly. I couldn't seem to concentrate long enough to weigh the worth of each thought, isolate its potential, allow it to grow. Instead, my mistakes, self-doubt, insecurities, and wandering mind left me high and dry. I think that's a really key passage. It's his own self-doubt that is what was holding him back. It was never too long before I lowered my pen and set down my journal. It's the life of the mind that matters, I told myself as I picked up The Catcher in the Rye off my bedside table. I figured my body would catch up later and write it all down. Of course, my body never did. I decided my biggest writing problem was that I didn't have anything worthwhile to write about, nothing interesting happening to me. Sure, living in a welfare motel for my senior year in high school was unusual, but it was not extraordinary, or so I thought. But I had to keep practicing, and when the day came when something interesting did happen to me, I'd be ready. That's the best I could do. So I did it. And that's something interesting to think about, is like sometimes you feel like your life is not spectacular, or that there's nothing interesting to write about. So when you are thinking about writing your personal narrative, is think, well, let me check with somebody. Maybe my normal is not normal to everybody else, and maybe there is something interesting in that story. My school building had been a former prison. The city built a new prison, moved the inmates into their new quarters, then rehabbed the old prison and turned it into a high school. Members of the school board said the city was growing so fast they had no choice but to take advantage of the existing structures. They removed the razor wire but kept the 12-foot high fence. Now, how awful would that feel to go to a school that had a 12-foot high fence and felt like you were constantly trapped? The concrete guard towers were turned into headquarters for service clubs like Interact and Junior Achievement. There was a gate out front where the buses pulled up, and the principal could throw a switch in his office and the gate would automatically open and close. He seemed to enjoy that, and at the end of each day would announce on the intercom that we were free to go, and we fled. The school cleared out in minutes, just as any prison would have if the warden opened the gate. That might actually make for an interesting journal. I'm going to try and remember that, because do you feel like you're in a prison when you're in school, and that like when you're let out, it's like freedom finally at last? And shouldn't schools be somewhere where you want to go? Next page, page 24. At sunrise, there was no prisoners left behind, but evidence of their trapped lives was everywhere. Even though the bars were removed, I could still see the jagged edges above and below the windows where they had been unevenly cut with an acetylene torch. And in the right light, no amount of fresh paint covered up what had been gouged into the concrete walls. Curse words, lovers' names, crude drawings of sex or organs, sex objects, and sex acts. One wall was entirely worked into a life-size portrait of a naked woman reclining. I'd sit in a desk next to her and slowly trace the curves with my fingertips. It was sexy to imagine myself in prison. This is a question, by the way. I'd let my mind drift, and soon it was me behind the bars as a snotty kid in jail baiting say, I never thought that carrying a gun would lead to this. I used to love watching those sleazy crime dramas on Saturday afternoon TV. My favorite was The Violent Years, about a gang of teenage girls dressed in black leather who robbed and molested guys like me. One of the girls said, I shot a cop. So what? I never knew girls like that and wondered what they might do to me if I was lucky enough to be captured by them. I thought having my own place would automatically attract me to girls to me. I was mistaken. I was the spider who could not coax any flies into his web. I wanted girls to find me interesting, but maybe it was my whiny Holden Caulfield imitation of a boy in need of carnal therapy that got me nowhere. Or perhaps my sitting in the library with an intensely cheerless, poetic look on my face that only scared girls away. My big romance of the year was a crush on my psychology teacher, Mrs. Hall. It was her first year of teaching. She was fresh out of Ohio State. I'd sit at the front of her desk and make troubled brow faces, which I thought illustrated the deep level of neurosis I represented. I figured she was watching me as closely as if I were as a patient. It was only a matter of time, I figured, before she'd want to cure me, and I liked the idea that using a couch was part of the cure. I made straight A's for the first 12 weeks, and finally I got up the nerve to write her a letter about becoming a psychology and literature major. I didn't dare attempt a love letter. Besides, I didn't have to. Any psychology teacher would know that a soul-bearing letter from her most devoted student had a hidden meaning. After she received it, she caught me in the hallway and whispered, I need to speak with you tomorrow in my office. I could only imagine what she wanted me all alone. I figured I might start out talking about some personal observations inspired by Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, then move on to some sensitive appreciation of Plas the Bell Jar and its story of a woman's journey into madness. Then we could get more comfortable discussing love story. So funny, this guy's imagination is like so intense at such an early age. He's like creating his own like alternate reality. But our talk had no room for literary education. She had already been seduced. I'm quitting, she revealed in the confidence. I'm pregnant. I just wanted you to know that I've enjoyed your attention this semester, and I hope you keep up the good work. Well, we weren't expecting that, were we? That ended that. She was gone in a week. We had substitutes for the rest of the year. We read the textbook by chapter by chapter and took moronic mimeograph tests. My grades dropped to barely passing, and I was bored. I think that's normal for people who really enjoy reading. When it gets turned into like memorization and things like that, it kind of kills the love of reading. It loses the story. And so sometimes I feel guilty making us do some of these like more basic things with books because it kills the joy of just the story. I only saw Miss Hall once more. It was unfortunate timing, as I was in the spot of trouble. A kid from school, Tony Gorda, had sold me a new car stereo. It was still in the package. I paid him and then found out it wouldn't work with my car. He told me to return it to the store for another model. When I did, the salesperson called security on me, and two big guys swooped down and grabbed my arms. It turned out that Tony had shoplifted the stereo. The two big guys hoisted me up and carried me across the parking lot towards my car. They wanted to check my trunk and see if I had any more loot. As they carried me with my toes just barely ticking the asphalt, Miss Hall pulled up in her car. Is anything wrong, Jack? She asked, eyeballing the two gorillas on each side of me. No, ma'am, I replied, trying to act casually as I smiled down at her and her extended belly. Now, see, this, I think this, you could say this is probably like foreshadowing or like the beginning of the problem is like, it wasn't that he did a bad thing. He didn't realize that this guy who was kind of seedy was getting him wrapped up in bad things. Well, then have a good day, she said, and she drove away. For a psychology teacher, she didn't have much of an eye for spotting trouble when it poked her in the nose. No wonder she was in a family way. After the guerrillas found no loot in my trunk, they dragged me back into their cramped security office where I signed a release allowing the store to keep the stereo. Then I was free to go, which I did very quickly. One afternoon, the principal called the entire school down to the auditorium to meet some special alumni. A traveling foursome of lifers from Rafford State Prison had come to address us regarding the perils of criminal behavior. Early in their prison lives, they had spent some time incarcerated where we are now going to school. So now we know he went to Rafford State Prison. We filed down the dark halls and entered the former prison cafeteria. Once we took our seats, the convicts parted the red velvet stage curtain and sat down on folding chairs. They were broad-striped black and white uniforms and looked like they might launch into a rendition of Jailhouse Rock until a club-wielding guard joined them and announced, "These men you see here will never be released from prison. They regret their crimes, but it's too late for regret. Their lives are ruined, but they have volunteered to speak with you all today about the perils of criminal life. Please listen carefully. Someday you will graduate, but you will not want to go to your class reunion dressed like these guys." What could they say that would possibly change my life? I was enjoying my life just fine. I wasn't going to become a criminal. I was going to be a writer. And if not a writer, I wasn't sure what I might do, but I certainly had no interest in becoming a criminal. Again, this is some great foreshadowing. Is like, he didn't intend for those things to happen. He wanted to be a writer. He had goals, but like, then we have to decide, where did it go wrong? The first prisoner stood up and strutted back and forth like a bow-legged bulldog. He said dramatically as he punched himself hard in the chest, have an anger problem. He told how bullies beat him up every day. He used to like reading, but the bullies ripped his books to shreds. At that moment, he picked up the yellow pages from the stage and to illustrate what the bullies did to him and his anger problems, he ripped the book clean in half, tossing the two pieces over his shoulders. Kids laughed out loud. We couldn't help ourselves. The show seemed so ridiculously fake. We kept laughing until the principal snapped his fingers at us. The prisoners went on to declare that he stopped reading and started fighting back, and kept on fighting back until he killed a man with his bare hands. Suddenly, he thrust his fist towards us, and when he opened his hands, they were glistening with stage blood. He was now serving a life sentence and advised us to control our temper. The next guy was a little nervous as a dragonfly. He wore big glasses and buzzed on about drugs in a whiny insect voice. First he'd smoked marijuana, then he took pills, and he started mainlining heroin. Oh, wow. China white, Iranian tar, Mexican brown. He went on to impress us with his knowledge of the opium-growing regions of the world. The more he talked about how good it had made him feel, with a skinny needle in my arm and the blood blooming in the syringe, the higher his voice rose. By the time he started using words like rapture and sexiness, he was swooping around as if he were having a seizure. Finally, the guard cut him off. What he means to tell you, the guard summarized in case we missed the message, is that once you start with drugs, you end up like him, a dope fiend who can only spend the rest of his days behind bars dreaming of the past. He escorted the dragonfly back to his seat. I watched as he slumped forward in a memory of high. The third guy had been a mail thief as a kid. I started out small, he announced, and he went on to tell us about how he stole cash from birthday cards, then checks, and then he robbed a string of banks. And by misfortune, he happened to shoot a bank guard and now is doing life. He advised us to work honestly and for our money and live within our means. Nobody seemed impressed with his reasonable advice, given where he was now spending all of his time. The last man was in for sex crimes. As he spoke, he never failed or he never raised his eyes above his shoes. When he was a boy, he didn't have any friends to play with. He spent a lot of time alone. He didn't have much to do. He discovered masturbation. He wished he had exercised self-control and gone into the seminary. He never meant to hurt those women, and in prison he said he had embraced the teaching of Jesus Christ and was a better man for it. He wanted us to forgive him. A half-hearted murmur of forgiveness broke out in pockets. I wasn't buying it. It seemed to me that no amount of forgiveness would ever wash away his need to be forgiven every day. He reminded me of the Flannery O'Connor story I loved, A Good Man is Hard to Find, where the misfit shoots the hugely annoying grandmother to death and then says she would have been a good woman if somebody had been there to shoot her every minute of her life. Wouldn't we all? As I watched the prisoners being marched away, I knew there was nothing we had in common. I wasn't angry. I didn't use drugs. I didn't steal. I wasn't a rapist. But something was wrong. I felt a drift inside, as if I had a compulsion not to be myself. I especially had that feeling when I read books. I seemed to become the main character, as if I had abandoned myself and allowed some other person to step right in and take me over. It was a great ride becoming a fictional character for a day or a week, but when the temporary visitor left, I felt as empty as a bottle, and when I regained my own voice, it was always strangely scarred from the experience, as though something in me had been torn open and then healed over. But that didn't mean I'd end up in prison. So I'm going to stop there for this part, and I'm just going to leave you thinking, like, is there something about people that maybe go down the wrong path because they lack self-identity, they lack a strong sense of self, they're easily influenced, and he's easily influenced, as he says, by the characters in the books. And so maybe had his parents been there to kind of help him guide to find himself and who he really was, maybe he wouldn't have ended up where he was.